everyone, and thanks for joining us. We're here as part of the conference, but really we are also representing the What Works Cities initiative, which is one of Bloomberg Philanthropy's big pushes through their government innovations work to help cities understand how they can best use data to support decision making. The last time I was here at this conference, we were just launching, and we had a very ambitious goal to go to 100 cities in the United States, mid-sized cities defined with populations of 100,000 to 1 million, and sort of collect a national baseline of how cities are using data to support decision making. Today we're going to just provide a little bit of an update on our work. We've been providing technical assistance into those cities. We've been working with a full partnership. And we're going to talk specifically about how, in one sort of vertical of the work that we've seen, how we've had an impact and kind of where we see the future of this field going. And so I'm joined today, very fortunately, by a terrific panel. Directly to my left is Elspeth Kirkman, who is our partner in this work. So I'm Beth Blauer. I lead the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University. And we work with Elspeth, who is the head of the Behavioral Insights team based here in New York. And we are partnered with Results for America and the Harvard Government Performance Lab and Sunlight Foundation in a big initiative, in the What Works Cities initiative, pushing out this work into cities. And then we also are joined by two of our cities today, where we're going to talk through some practical examples of our work through the lens of housing. And so that's Kate Bender and Con Rusa. So Kate comes from Kansas City. If anyone is interested in doing data-driven performance management work in your cities, in your governments, Kate is probably one of the preeminent leaders of this work in the country. She's been heartily leading a team in Kansas City with much envy of a lot of other cities around a whole platform of different issues using data, evidence, best practice, and some of the most advanced analytics work to think about some of the problems that Kansas City is facing. And then Con also is coming from a really sophisticated city. The mayor in San Jose has done a tremendous job building up the capabilities of the city and thinking about how data and evidence can really impact the lives of people that live in that city. So thanks so much for everyone to join us. Before we kick off into the session, I'm just going to take a couple minutes to give an update on the What Works Cities work. So 2 years ago when I was with you, we launched and we had this goal of going into 100 cities. I can proudly say that we have gone into over 100 cities to sort of determine where they are on this sort of a maturity model, this curve around the use of data and evidence. And this week, amongst us, we'll announce that we will have completed or launched work in 90 of those cities. So that means a technical assistance partner like GovX or BIT or Harvard or Sunlight Foundation has gone in and actually provided some technical assistance to advance the practice of data and evidence in that particular city. At GovX, we have been focused on sort of the core foundational work that is required to do data work in cities. So if you think about governance and you think about the context of the use of data, if you think about what data gets expressed to the public, how it gets expressed, how data moves through your city, we're really investing in those practices. And now we're also launching, or have launched in the last year, an analytics practice where we help cities really think about data as a mechanism for expediting an outcome, for thinking really critically about some of their issues, and how they're building or baking the use of data into a lot of the work that they're doing from a routine perspective. And one of the cities that we look at and we think about is the city of Seattle, where we completed a project last year. And it was focused on housing. So today's panel is really going to focus on the housing work. I want to talk a little bit about our housing work very quickly. And then we want to talk about how the use of data is evolving and also how we can make sure that we're not relying on systems in the use of our data that are going to attribute to worse outcomes for people who are living in city, that are going to continue traditions of real deltas in the way or the equitable distribution of resources for cities, and use the lens of housing. And the example that I'm going to talk quickly about is the city of Seattle, who has built an entire performance approach to the way that they look at housing data in their city to make sure that they are not only bringing enough affordable housing online, but that it's a match to the population of people who actually need affordable housing. When we go into cities and we think about the housing work, we think about it as a continuum. We work with cities who are focused mostly on one end of that continuum, whether that's a reduction in homelessness, whether that's trying to actually create enough affordable housing or get access to affordable housing. We work also with a big subsect of our cities, like the city I live in Baltimore, where there is 40% of our housing stock is blighted. So how do we make sure that that housing is safe, that we're eliminating some of that blighted stock, that we're making the right interventions to make sure that people are living in communities, that there are deep connections to each other and to people, and that they're thriving. And then this access to affordable housing, where we're making sure that the data capacity exists in cities so that they know what affordable housing exists, which is oftentimes one of the most difficult things that cities face. That is a match for their needs. And they also know which affordable housing units are grandfathering out of covenants that have been made through grant programs at the federal government or at the state level, so that they have real-time information on the actual access to it and that it's a match to the demand. And Seattle has done that by creating a data system where they're pulling from multiple systems, where they're trying to think about areas and align where the need and where the stock is. And then they're creating policy by having routine meetings around that data and making sure on a regular basis that they're engaging the right stakeholders to do that work. And it's a work in progress, certainly, but it's helped them to really identify some real big loops or gaps in where they have access to housing. And so what I'd like to do is to pull in two additional city examples, and I'm going to start first with Kate Bender, talk a little bit about your housing work in Kansas City, and a little bit about sort of the context of it from the strengths of the data and where, how your process has worked, and then Con will bring you in also to hear a little bit about San Jose's work. Kate?
Great, thanks, Beth. As Beth said, I'm Kate Bender. I've been with the city of Kansas City, Missouri for 10 years now with the Office of Performance Management, which is a division of the city manager's office. And it's been around for about 8 years. We've built our team over that time frame from 1 person to 4, but we've really continued our emphasis on improving city services through data-driven management throughout that time. So our focus has been the same, but our scope has widened, our resources have widened somewhat. So I'm really happy to be back in New York today. I went to school at NYU for grad school, any of you who are at NYU, current students or former. When I was asked to be on the panel, my first instinct was like, how could I say no to being on the panel with these amazing people? But my second instinct was like, I'm not the right person. I don't have enough to add to this issue, and I don't have enough to say. And the reason for that is that housing is a relatively recent issue for Kansas City, which sounds crazy, especially if you're sitting in New York right now, thinking about East Coast, West Coast. Affordable housing has been at the top of the agenda for most cities for a long time. But Kansas City, when I started with the city, we didn't have a strategic plan at the time. And so we focused on areas that were coming up a lot through our 311 requests that were kind of rising to the top from the citizen perspective. And really, housing wasn't one of those. And part of that is because Kansas City has a incredibly low cost of living compared to a lot of other cities. So quick sidebar advertisement for anybody who's looking for a future home. One thing that was very much on the radar and has been consistently was neighborhood revitalization and blight. Like many cities, we have an issue with our urban core hollowing out over the last few decades, and then kind of resulting issues with blight that remain. And so we've focused a lot of our attention on code enforcement as a resource. We've developed a land bank. We've actually worked with the Center for Government Excellence, are working with them on a data analytic model to optimize our code enforcement, to try to maximize that as a resource to improve our neighborhoods. But one thing, as we were doing a ton of data analysis and process improvement and really honing in on this issue of blight in neighborhoods, I was really bothered by the fact that I couldn't identify a good outcome measurement for neighborhoods. I couldn't find an objective way to say this neighborhood is more challenged than this neighborhood. And obviously, there's never going to be one measure. Because neighborhoods are multifaceted. But I couldn't even find one. And so I kind of sought around and looking for this, and we ended up pursuing a really great data analysis model in partnership with the Reinvestment Fund, which is a CDFI out of Philadelphia. That was called the market value analysis. And what it allowed us to do was to hone in on the residential housing, the strength of the residential housing market in our neighborhoods at a census block group level. And so that's really been a kicking off point for us in terms of looking at housing and identifying under all the underlying layers, is understanding, what's the strength of this neighborhood versus this, and then being able to correlate that with a lot of other factors and understand what's driving that. And where we're at now is taking that model and using it to direct city services and resources, but also thinking about it from a much broader scale. Because one thing that's been very clear to me since we honed in on this issue is that housing is very multifaceted and multi-sector. And so that data product that we acquired, we have made it completely open, transparent. It's on our open data portal, and we really want it to be something that's used broadly across sectors and by researchers, by other entities, because we think that that'll really add to our ability to invest strategically, is if everyone is coming at it from a common perspective in terms of data.
Great.
All right, Con?
Well, good morning, everyone. Con Rusa with the San Jose Mayor's Office of Strategic Partnerships and Performance. And thank you again for Results for America, for Beth, for all the work that you're leading. San Jose is really proud to be a wet work city. I think through the work, we've been able to figure out how to get people to use our illegal dumping program more effectively. We've launched our open data platform and policy, and we could not have done that without the support. A couple of caveats: I'm not the expert on this work either. There's an amazing team at the City and Mayor's Office, such as Shireen Shantarsham, who's our Chief Innovation Officer, Henry Tsai, Kip Harkness, who work on this, and we're really proud to have kind of their leadership. So the problem that we were trying to solve for San Jose was figuring out how to make housing inspections more effective so that we can keep our community safe, right? So you might have heard that there was a balcony collapse in Berkeley in 2015. Because of that collapse, 6 people died and 7 people were injured. And for us, we wanted to kind of prevent those types of issues. But the main question for us was, which buildings should we inspect to catch the largest number of violations to ensure the community's safety? So San Jose is the 10th largest city in the United States. We have about 1 million residents. And within the city itself, there's about 4,500 what we call multiple housing properties. So these are hotels, motels, shelters, sorority, fraternity houses. And we just don't, and ideally we would love to go and inspect all of them regularly, but we just don't have the money and the resources to do that. And we wanted to be much smarter about it. So we went and asked Bloomberg, said, hey, we know that this work is being done across the country. How can we leverage that? So we partnered with the University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins University, the Civic Analytics Network, and developed a predictive model. So working with the city, we identified 6,000 variables that you might consider when figuring out how to do your inspection. And that then resulted in 145,000 predictive models that we can use. And I want you to focus on this slide, because we'll go back to this in a little bit as we talk more about the bias component of building out the model. So once the 145,000 predictive models were created, we asked ourselves, how do you know which one is best, right? So we used a technique called intertemporal cross-validation. To this group, I don't really need to explain what that is, because you guys are all data experts here. But for folks like me that weren't experts in this, it was explained to me that we basically ran simulations, and we used historical data to test all of those predictive models to see what worked best and whether the models that we created correlated or can be used as predictive reason for inspections. And we ran it for 2014, then we ran it for 2015, then we ran it for 2016. And then we took all of those results and then figured out which of the 145,000 predictive models did the best. So the question was the predictive models actually better, right? And luckily, The answer was yes. So with the predictive model, we found that we would have caught actually 77% more of the serious violations with the same resources. And that's where the smarter, really comes in. Because again, if we had unlimited resources, we would just suspect everything. But we wanted to make sure that our community was staying safe. So we wanted to see how can we improve catching the serious violations. And that resulted in a 31% improvement from our base. And 31% is really significant for us as a city. So since this panel is about bias and how do we kind of insert or have those conversations about bias, I want to go back to that predictive model. So then just in preparing for this panel, I went to the team that worked on this project. I went to our housing inspectors. I went to our code enforcement inspectors. I was like, hey, how do we check for bias? Right? What do we do? And then the answers, unfortunately, were not really exciting, right? Like, first, people get defensive, right? Because nobody tries to be biased or racist or inappropriate in doing their work. And it's like, no, this is a safe space. Let's really just have a candid conversation about it. So then we kind of teased it out. And the reality is we did not have a systematic process for checking for bias. Right? Like there weren't sets of questions, there weren't criteria, there weren't tests that we were conducting. So then we had to go to like the anecdotal stuff that was incredibly unsatisfying. Like, well, our staff, they went through diversity training, so that might have helped with checking for bias, right? Oh, wait, our staff is diverse, right? So they have cultural competency, and that must be able to check for some of this bias. And to be fair, we do have an incredibly diverse staff. San Jose is 33% Latino, 33% Asian, 30% white. So we have an incredibly diverse community. And then, it devolved to these, well, we talked to people on the ground, right? And that helped us check for bias. And then we just defaulted to well, the university, University of Chicago can't be racist, right? We'll just depend on them. If there was any bias, then they would have kind of caught it. So then it was like, okay, unsatisfying. So then now what, right? So we wanted to be able to figure out now. And then there was all this pushback. It's like, well, Con, we shouldn't be even asking that question because this is about safety, right? This is about, targeting the buildings that are going to threaten the health and safety of our residents, and that's our #1 goal. So it's like, okay, no, that's not going to work. So unfortunately for us, this process actually brought more questions than answers. Luckily, we're still in the testing phase of all of these models. We're still on the ground. We're looking at the predictive model, and starting from July to December, we're testing it. Now we're going to go back, and we're going to ask these questions again and see, okay, now what do we do? This work, this actually has been incredibly important because our next big housing data project is about our rent registry. Right, so San Jose implemented rent control for the first time. We have to figure out how to collect that information. And the goal is to build it in a way that allows us to kind of predict or understand where the bad actors might be. And how can we then now systematically develop the process for checking for bias and making sure that, in that tool, we aren't pricing our community out or disenfranchising people even more.
Thank you. Very good point. And I think one of the big takeaways we hope you get from the panel is that this is a very nascent approach. And particularly when we're thinking about doing sort of the more advanced analytics, a lot of times the data sources, the systems of origin where a lot of the data is being expressed from, have been baked in bias itself, right? Whether they've been oriented around legislative districts that have been influenced by biased decision making, whether collection methodologies were focused on particular communities over other communities based on the tax base in those particular communities. And so the work that we're doing is trying to ask our cities to think about those systems of origin, design new systems that are trying to minimize the risk of using bias data. And then on the back end, when you're relying on data that could have been influenced by bias, to think about from a policy perspective, what are your interventions going to look like? So you produce a list of houses that need, we're doing this project in Baltimore where we are predicting where blight will break out. And so we're looking at what are the intervention points? How are we thinking about the intervention points? And how do we create policy so that those are equitably distributed, those interventions? And so we're not just focusing on more economically affluent communities. We're not looking at economic development as a leading indicator for interventions, but we're building a policy around the interventions themselves. And so today we really want to get you thinking about what are those systems that you're relying on? How were they built? Where does that data come from? And if you are procuring new technology, if you're thinking about new data collection methodologies, how can you also make sure that your interventions are going to minimize the risk of bias being baked into the outputs and outcomes that you're trying to influence through your work? And I know that you are thinking a lot about all of this and are doing a lot of work in sort of the very focused arena that you work. And it's also really kind of horizon cutting. So I want to hear a little bit more about your work, and then we hope to have some time for some questions.
Great. So I work in behavioral science. So what on earth is that, to kind of start off? Behavioral science kind of tries to explain, I guess, the gap between what an economist might predict that people will do, or what people should do in order to kind of optimize their outcomes faced with a set of choices, and what people actually do, because we're all human. So it's always helpful to give a kind of practical example of that. So people who came in a little bit late should probably come and sit in one of the empty seats because you'll be a lot more comfortable. But instead, because you've observed the behavior of others, you've chosen to stay at the back. So please come and have a seat if you're standing. There's some reserved ones here, but I think at this stage, you snooze, you lose. So you should just come and sit down. And so people kind of operate on these two systems, right? So this is this kind of very basic theory of behavioral science. It's called dual process theory. And the clicker appears to have stopped a little bit. But people operate in these two ways. So we have this system one, which is this kind of frame of mind where we're being fast. We're kind of working on this thing we call intuition, which is just a set of internalized kind of quick rules to help us make sense of the world. And we're not really thinking. We're kind of sleepwalking or on autopilot. And then we have system two, which is basically our inner kind of deep thinking philosopher system. This is our sort of supercomputer, and it's our brain in all its sort of glory. So, you know, system one, for example, might help you, if you're doing a simple thing like 2 times 2, you're probably going to be using system one. If you're doing 139 times 17, you're probably going to have to move to system two. And basically, historically, what we've done is we've kind of designed, as economists and as policymakers, we've designed assuming that people are operating on system two, assuming that we're thinking deeply and making kind of conscious choices and that we're always trying to optimize. And the reality is that most of the time, all of us are kind of wandering around on system one. And so really what we do at the Behavioral Insights team is we try and say, we're not going to change human nature. We're not going to get people to operate on system two. Instead, how do we design the kind of choice environment and get people to make decisions and take action by appealing to system one? So, very serious scientists who have won Nobel Prizes, including Daniel Kahneman here, have basically done this research to show that our environment is often as important as the actual choice we're being faced with ourselves, and it really influences the way that we make decisions. So how do we kind of apply this in practice? We use this framework which distills behavioral science into 4 very, very simple kind of rules. If you want people to do something, make it really easy for them to do it. If you don't want them to do something, make it really bloody hard. Make it attractive to them. These are kind of no-brainers. Make it social. So we're social animals. We take our cues from how other people behave. Let's kind of appeal to that. And make it timely. Ask people at the right time when they're sort of susceptible to doing something. So some examples of what I actually mean by this in action. This is Louisville, Kentucky. We did some work with their blight team in Louisville. The blight team was sending out letters when they'd conducted an inspection. This is their standard letter that they were sending. This letter basically says, fix your property and pay a fine to anybody that's had a kind of failed inspection. But instead of saying that, it starts with the line something like, according to the ordinances of Section 55 of the 1974 Act of... Anyway, it's got a whole 2 paragraphs on legislation, which is fascinating, but not necessarily that helpful as a call to action. And what we often think about is this thing we call the flip test. So people have such a limited amount of attention that they're going to give to your thing, your government communication. If you can't flip over a piece of paper, have someone look at it for 5 minutes, flip it back, and they can tell you what you're asking them, then it's probably going to not actually penetrate and get through. Now, this isn't actually a great example of how we tried to pass the flip test because the system was particularly kind of rigid in terms of how it allowed us to modify it. But what we did is we just redesigned the letter to make it super simple. So instead of whatever that title is, something like official citation, we just changed it to fix your property and pay your fine. And then we just kind of tried to make the call to action very clear. Things like, I mean, this was a super interesting example in that the Blight code enforcement team is responsible for sending these things out. When we asked, let's tell people actually how to pay if they need to pay a fine, we had to all sit in a room and ring accounts receivable and ask them how one would make a payment, because it's not in the kind of remit of the code enforcement team to worry about that. So just getting, all of those dots joined up on the process and then communicating it in a way that people might understand was quite helpful. And what were the results? So we tested these two letters against each other. We used a randomized control trial, which I'm happy to answer more questions on. And we found that simpler letters get more people to fix their property. I think the result of this is about 140 avoided inspections a year, and that's probably the lower end estimate. So without spending any additional money, this was just changing the existing letter, we managed to make that process much more efficient and get people fixed up sooner. It also actually worked in terms of getting people to pay their fine. So making stuff attractive, we don't mean throw money at the problem, right? So here's a really good example of something that is designed for equity. So housing folks often use lotteries, whether it's for affordable housing to buy it, whether it's in the rental sector. The point of a lottery, right, is that it's fair. So, you enter into it and you have the same chance as everybody else, and maybe sometimes they're weighted. The problem with a lottery is that they really appeal to our kind of most irrational self. So there is so much research that shows that people absolutely fail to optimize when they're given the opportunity to participate in a lottery. And it's certainly true that there's some value just from like the excitement factor of being in a lottery. But I often kind of think about what does that do to people's choices around housing? How many people are waiting to win the lottery when actually they're never going to? And really maybe they should be kind of taking advantage of a different scheme or something else available to them. And we haven't done research on this yet. Would absolutely love to, but it strikes me that potentially kind of reframing not having a lottery could be a super powerful way of getting people to think more about the choices they're making. So making stuff social. The example I have here is something that we did here in New York City. Basically getting people to recertify for their housing, to be eligible for their Section 8 housing status. Pretty straightforward thing to do. Lots of people miss the deadline, and actually, once you miss it, puts you in jeopardy of losing your accommodation, essentially. So we're working with the City of New York actually around getting people to do this online rather than, getting them to do it full stop. But what we found was interesting was just telling people this true fact that the majority of their neighbours now do this online. Was really effective at getting them to sign up. And this is compared to another behaviourally informed letter that we tested, which was actually around this sense of, I've done something for you, please do something in return. So the housing authority was saying, we've designed this new online system, all you need to do is use it, we'd love it if you would. But actually this sort of social norms message did a lot better, and it did particularly well for new tenants who just moved in, who are looking for kind of cues about how their neighbours behave, so I guess they can kind of fit into their new community. So, small tweak again that makes a big difference. And then lastly, making stuff timely. So this one's not about housing, this is about bikes. But we just did some work in Portland on getting people to use the bike share scheme. The city was sending out discount offers to a bunch of folks across the city. And we had these two groups, these two different demographics that we were interested in the response. So half of them were people who had a new bike docking station built near their current house. And then some of them were people who'd just moved into a new house. And some of the stuff we know about habit formation from the behavioural science literature is that people are much more likely to change their behaviour when all of their other routines have also just been broken. So moving house is a really fantastic moment to target someone. And we found that, yes, that is true for using the bike share scheme. People are about 4 times more likely to take up these discount vouchers if they had moved house rather than if they'd just had a new docking station built near them. So, small things that are quite tactical that can be done today, tomorrow, next week, with a bit of good testing to kind of work out, how do we chip away at this housing issue.
Okay, Well, I wanted to give the opportunity to, I have some questions, but also I wanted to make sure that if there were questions that you had the opportunity to sort of tap into the subject matter expertise that's on the panel. So are there any questions right now? Yep.
Sorry, I just had a really simple question. The effect sizes seem to be really small, like going from 0.31% to 1.3. Is that common in these kinds of studies? I'm not familiar with this area at all, but it seems really small.
Yeah, so, and I should have kind of prefaced this, I guess, with my intent with this piece of it is to say, if we tackle these incredibly small moments where we're trying not to spend any more money, we're trying to just optimize the thing that's already being done, those effect sizes are quite common. But then you will see kind of, you know, if you're working a little bit more upstream, there's a bunch of work we've done, for example, around like changing defaults. So we did some work, totally different topic area, but on pension reform in the UK, getting people to save for retirement. And changed it so that when you start a new job, you have to opt out of being in a workplace pension as opposed to opting into it. And the effect sizes on something like that are absolutely enormous because, you know, it's a kind of much bigger sort of choice architecture change. These are just, you know, tweaks to a communication and that kind of stuff. So you're not going to see anything particularly huge. Yeah.
Hi, well, thank you all. And we've heard some great things about changing practices, whether it be government practices or individuals, people's actions. I'm wondering if you, perhaps any of the San Jose, Kansas City, or it's open to anybody, has anything you've put together gone further up the chain and actually influenced policy? Can you talk about how receptive the local governments have been to some of the data that you're finding in terms of actually shaping the policy?
Yeah, so as we delved into this world of housing and you know, coming off of looking at blight reduction and then started honing in on housing, it became really clear to us that a major both issue and opportunity we have is that we don't have any rental housing regulation in Kansas City. We have a really large proportion, much larger than most cities, of single-family houses being used as rental units, and that's just mostly because we have a large proportion of single-family housing. We're not built out in an incredibly dense way, and so we're about 55% homeowner, 45% rental, and if a lot of your housing stock is single-family, kind of the transit property, a lot of single families are being used as rentals. And having single families as rentals also means that there's a ton of mom and pop landlords out there. I mean, like the person who's like, I'm going to buy a house for fun. I've never owned a house. I've never been a landlord. Or maybe I just bought my own house and now I'm going to rent out to this other person. And so with no regulatory structure around that, there's just not a lot of incentives to, I mean, there's the normal human incentives of like trying to be a good person, but I don't know how strong those are. But there's no structure in place to say here's the standard at which your house should be, and because it's not a large property owner in many cases, they don't have the resources or they don't have the history or the experience, and even it also creates really bad incentives for bad actors who do own a lot of houses and just don't keep them up, and they know they can turn them over and over again to people who are really kind of really challenged on income and other resources, and there's not going to be a consequence. So we've been pursuing a rental housing regulation, gotten some great technical assistance on that, and it's been driven through the mayor's office and through one of our council people who've been really kind of leading the charge. And I think that the data that we've been able to bring to bear about, you know, both the proportion of units we have out there, and then also just recently being able to gather some data from our resident survey, which we do a large random sample survey on a quarterly basis of our residents, you know, that really shows that this impact of quality housing hits low-income people the hardest. And so we developed a really great structure for this. Unfortunately, or fortunately, yes, depending on your perspective, we are required under state law to take anything that creates new revenue to the ballot. So we don't have the ability to just enact this with our council. I think if we could, I think we'd probably be there, but we need to go through the step of putting on a ballot and getting a citywide vote. But we've really moved, gone from bringing this just has been brought to the table in the last year, basically, and already there's been a sea change in people understanding it and the need for it.
I have a quick answer to that. We've been dealing with this in the Bay Area for the last 15, 20 years. So for us, the biggest policy change was our inclusionary housing policy, which now makes sure that there's a distribution of different types of housing for all new developments. That being said, that was an 8-year process. It was challenged in the courts multiple times, and we finally got it over the goalpost just last year.
So this question is for Kate and Khan. I'm Maria from Chile at a university there, working on data science. And I was wondering, now that there's an awareness of, okay, we should address bias when we, as managers, we start a project. Do you have any framework for which to do this? Are you using anything? Because this is coming up in several projects we're doing with local government in Chile. So I was wondering if there's something you can use to actually just put it in the, the project management cycle and actually address it.
Luckily, one of the things that San Jose was able to draw from is that we are a My Brother's Keeper city, and that also helped facilitated conversations about race and social economics. My Brother's Keeper is an initiative that focuses on improving outcomes for boys and men of color. So that is the framework in which we are using, but it's not even that difficult. It's creating a safe space to have the conversation. Like the defensive mechanisms, naturally really come up. So, for us, there's key sets of questions that we apply to the ways that we allocated funding for programming that we'll now also try to apply to other departments. But it's really that simple. Like, just ask the question to begin with.
And to be intentional about it. So to think about whether it's a procurement of new systems, whether it's the leverage of data out of existing systems. If you've got if you've got a strong governance, either a committee or you've got a governance team that's working on this issue, it has to be on the agenda. It can't be something that's talked about off agenda. It has to be directly architected into the thinking around the process. It has to be contemplated in the methodology, and it has to sort of be baked in. And the way that you do that is you make it relevant and you bring intentionality to the conversation about it. I think from a framework perspective, we've got a lot of governments that are migrating from larger enterprise-wide systems and are starting to get data through smaller systems, through SaaS, through all different mechanisms. And so when you're having conversations with vendors, when you're having conversation with people that are working on our teams that are managing data, you just have to make sure that there's that intentionality that's brought into it, and that we're seeing reflected in policy, we're seeing it reflected in those conversations, but also we're seeing it in contracts now. So when you are, whether it's like Hansen, you're contracting with Hansen to renew your maintenance contracts around the distribution of work, that you have to be really intentional about equity and how you're making sure that communities are represented in the decision making itself. Is there another question?
I'm curious how you define blight and how that data relates to bias. So
in Baltimore, a blighted property is a sort of an abandoned property. So that means that either the ownership is unknown, or that the owner has essentially said, I don't want the property, and has walked away from the property, and that there's no one actually living in the property. So it's empty of residents, and it's been sort of abandoned, and then the city has to make a decision as to whether it comes into their stock or whether it's viable, and there's a series of decisions that flow from that. It's defined differently in different cities. I don't know if you guys have a different definition.
I wouldn't say that we have, a core like blight is equal, but ours is, I think, very tied to our property code enforcement and looking at the different types of violations that are present and the concentration of violations, both on the sort of property side and also nuisance side, which is more things that aren't necessarily tied to structures, but, tall weeds, trash, abandoned vehicles, things like that. So it's like, I hate to go to the when you see it definition. From a data standpoint, it is, we can look at the concentration of those different factors and get at a pretty good understanding.
Yep.
And we're using predictive models to detect where blight is happening and also where we're on the verge of blight. And that's being fed from data that's like utility data, that's trash complaints, that's graffiti. So it's sourced from a ton of the 311 data. A lot of it is on the utility side. And then we also overlay that oftentimes in cities with crime data, with school attendance data, with tax and lien data. So there's a lot of data that feeds into understanding sort of the dynamics of housing occupancy.
We also, and just remember, we also added a question to our resident survey again to just try to get that perspective from them about satisfaction with the appearance of your neighborhood, which isn't a one-to-one, but that's proven to be really strongly correlated too with property violations and other indicators of blight.
And do you find that neighbors are saying, oh, but by the way, there's this vacant house that's sort of in that, and you're capturing that in your data collection at the survey point?
It's not that directly, but it's more standing back and correlating with other factors. So, you know, another area that we've had a huge emphasis over the last few years is we've had a big initiative to remove what we call dangerous buildings. They're basically abandoned and vacant properties that are structurally unsound. We have a backlog of those, and we have invested some concentrated resources in removing the backlog, because we can do a certain amount per year, but the issue we were having is it was like constantly more added, takes them down, more added. So we did a bond issuance to remove all the backlog over 3 years, with the, not just because it was like, well, let's put money at something. It was because looking across the issues of blight, we really identified that dangerous buildings were such a concentrated issue of blight, and really affecting a much broader area, but also potentially leading to additional blight. So it was sort of a strategy of let's go after like the worst issues and you know, hopefully see a good outcome of that.
Kind of building on that, you know, blight is a subjective thing. You know, your inspectors are going to see one thing and your residents might see another thing. How are you guys dealing with data quality issues on when you're bringing in data to make sure that your analyses kind of match with what's happening on the street?
We do that really poorly. You know, like, you guys are all data folks, right? Like, when I took my data science classes, like 90% of your time will be just focused on cleaning the data, right? So for us, it's about making those forms really easy. Like, people are still using paper forms in triplicate. It's like mind-boggling to me, right? But to purchase a tablet or a smartphone for every inspector is not something that the administration understands the value of yet, right? So we got to get them to the point so that we can standardize some of the entry. And then we came into the situation where it's like, there is 141 options in this dropdown. Like, that's not going to work either. So still a lot of work to be done, but your point is well taken in terms of data quality.
But when you do have a diversity of data and you're pulling from, you can fastly aware of which data is strong and which data is crap. And you're able to start to weight what so when you're dealing with, you know, like a large section, and housing data is so complex because there's so many issues that feed into housing issues and neighborhood issues, and that you have a wealth of data that you can rely on. And so the real value is like getting in the room and using the data, having conversations about it, really understanding what are the bounds of that data, who relies on it, why they rely on it. Like, the metadata layer when you're going through these exercises is so important and so valuable, because you can start to really communicate the value and the strengths of data. And you might have a really crappy data set that is really good at giving you insight into one particular issue. And the more you can really sort of understand it and push on it and think about it, the better it is. And then the sort of rising tide raises all ships. When you do get data, whether it's new systems that are coming online or whether it's data that's been well managed and maintained, you can start to influence the practice of other data collections and the methodology itself by having those conversations, so that it's not just you're taking data from a system and it's being input into another system, but that it's actually being brought to the table as you're trying to unpack an issue, that you're thinking about it from a policy perspective, that you're thinking about it, and that you're architecting your approach, whether that's a build out of an algorithm, whether that's a systems change, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, but you're doing it in the context of that conversation. And then you may decide we need to invest in creating a better pathway to improving the quality of data in this particular system. This collection methodology needs to change. But that doesn't happen unless you actually are talking about it and you're actually really thinking about the bounds of that data.
I have a question for Elspeth. It seems like the presentation of the results of a predictive model is a very compelling and attractive thing, like something that you would describe would appeal to System 1. Because it's easy, you follow these predictors and you'll just get a higher percentage of good results, as Khan showed. But a lot of times, no matter how much you try, you're always going to be, left with some amount of bias in it. So I'm wondering if you or other cognitive scientists have put thought into the presentation of the results of predictive models to highlight the bias so that people can interpret them not so automatically, or automatically but understand the bias as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting question, and then there are also some really interesting examples of where not necessarily the best predictive models, but when you kind of put people, you ask like 1,500 people rather, which stocks they think are going to perform best off a list of 10 stocks, the general public will just use the availability heuristic, which is like, I've heard of that one, so therefore I'll say that. And you put that against some sort of super duper algorithm, developed by traders, for example, and quite often the availability heuristic actually wins out because it turns out that the public consciousness and sentiment is actually a more powerful driver than than being able to kind of do a regression analysis on all the data and look at the line of best fit. So I'd also say that sometimes human bias, in some senses, can kind of almost be a competitor against it. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of people looking at that. There are some really good examples of where I think predictive models do more to eliminate bias than they do to kind of perpetuate it as well. Obviously, the focus is often on the kind of negative aspects of it. But there's some examples, for instance, of things like a model developed in cardiology units where cardiologists were systematically over-referring people with chest pain from certain ethnic groups because they know that that's a predictor of whether they're going to have a heart attack. It's actually a very, very small predictor with not an awful lot of weight relative to lots of other factors. And a predictive model was able to identify 3 physiological questions that almost always, if you can answer yes to them, mean that you're having a heart attack, and almost always, if you can answer no to any of them, mean that you're not. And that was much, much more effective at changing referral patterns by cardiologists than having them kind of make their very human decision where they were like, there's a lot of factors here, and one of them I can kind of see, in a fairly salient way. So I think, great question. Don't really know the answer, but there's some thoughts.
All right. Well, thank you, Elspeth, for your final answer. Kate, Khan, for joining us, and for all of you, thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.